So yesterday we talked about web security, and today we discuss about some other topics like public key infrastructure and certification authority. So in the web security, we discuss different things like how we can secure the web and what are the different methods applied and different protocols are used to apply the secure functions on the web applications. So today we discuss about further other topics like public key infrastructure and how public key is distributed by different certification authorities. So we will discuss them in detail here. So what is a public key crypto system or public key infrastructure? As you know that uh, for for encrypting the data, there are the different methods are used. Like for example, for encryption, we use a symmetric encryption as well as asymmetric encryption. So the encryption methods use the same key on both sender and the receiver. And when it is using a same key on both sender and receiver, that means it is actually encryption method that is called symmetric encryption, and it uses a private key, uh, that means which the user keep with itself and does not send to other users. So that's why we say that it's a private key crypto system. Or when there's a private key crypto system is used, that means the system is using a private key cryptography or symmetric encryption or symmetric key cryptography. And then we have a different key. If we are using different key for the encryption and for the decryption, then we are having having a structure, key structure that is called as a public key infrastructure. So where we are using private key for example, for encryption, then the public key will be used for decryption. Or for example, if we are using a public key for encryption, then the private key will be used for decryption. So in this way, there are the different methods of encryption. As we have symmetric encryption and asymmetric encryption. So it's possible that an attacker will launch an attack on to get that key, for example. So he will apply a main and middle attack. For example, it can eavesdrop or it can monitor the data that is coming from user A to user B, and then can get the key from that and get the information, other information from the, for example, user authentication information, username and password, or some key to encrypt the data and decrypt the data. So in this way, he can have a number of methods he can apply to get the information or critical information, send it by user A to user B. So in this way, they can be used for different certificates also. These keys to verify a particular certificate, either it could be using a public key or it is using a private key. For example, if it is using a public key, then it is actually it can be used for the encryption. If it is using a private key, then it can be used for example, authentication. So in this way, we have different structures for encrypting the data, as we discussed. So there are the different certificates are used. As I told you that these certificates are used to verify a particular user, that user is a legitimate user, and if it is once it is verified that the user is a legitimate user and he can send the data now to other user, and other user can verify him with the help of a certificate. So the format for the certificate is that, our structure for the certificate for is that, for example, if user A wants to send a certificate to user B, for example, so he can use a structure like that. For example, it uses sign SKA, then it is sending a key to user B, and the the key will be used by the receiver, and he will use that key to decrypt the information, and it can encrypt the information using other key, for example. So in this way, if there's a user A, there is a public key, and then he can send that public key to user B, for example, and he encrypts the data with the private key, and then the user B will decrypt the data with the public key. So in this way, he can do this by applying different certificates, and these different certificates are sent by user A to user B, and when they send these certificates, they can use that by for encryption and for decryption. For example, here this certificate, this figure further explain uh, the transitivity of a certificate, then how different certificate are sent it to other users. For example, there's a certificate that is sent it from user A to user B, and there's a certificate that is sent it from a user B to user C, for example, here, and that tells that how the certificates are encrypted and how the certificates are decrypted. For example, when it encrypts the message, for example, when it encrypts the data using some certificate, and when he encrypts that, so it will he will use some encryption methods, some certificates for that. So there is a possibility that, for example, if any certificate is for system C, for user C, for example, so it may be transferred from user B, for example, here. So in this way, we have different certificate chains here, which are used to send the certificate to other systems. So they send the certificates, and these certificates are very important in the sense that they are used to verify a particular user. And once they are verifying particular user, they also sending the data to other user, for example. So so we have these different forms of certificates are used, and then what is the usage, or what is the how why we are using these different certificates. For example, we can use these different certificates for verifying particular user, or for authenticating particular user, that either that particular user is actually a legitimate user, or either particular user is authorized user, which is given the permission to access for the data, which is given permission to access for a particular, you can say, particular data in the system. So in this way, it can collect different certificates from different users, and when they get different certificates, then they can also verify themselves. And once they verify themselves, they can send the information to other users. So in this way, we have different certificates are used, and different types of certificates which are based on different verifications, either publicly is be, will be used to encrypt the data, either it could be use a private key to encrypt the data. So when we are using the public key to encrypt the data and private key to encrypt the data, then they can encrypt different messages using these different keys. Now we have different other components which are involved in the certificates. Like, for example, we have certification authorities, and for example, they can revoke particular certificate if any of the time is expires for the particular certificate, for example, or they can reissue particular certificate for particular user, for example, or they have different certificate used for that situation. So if we are using different certificates for that situation, then we can have different, you can say, components for that. Means there's a user which is receiving the certificates, and there's a certification authority which is sending the certificate, and also uh, there's a model is, you can say, maybe designed to how the different certificates are sent it to different users, for example. So that we can do this with the help of we can see this with the help of public key infrastructure components. So these are the different components which are used for particular certificate. And then we have certification authority, and certification authority will define particular policies for that certificate. And for example, a certification authority will define particular policies which are used to authenticate a particular user. That particular user is a authorized user, or it can also define some policies for issuance of a particular certificate to the users, that either that particular certificate will be issued to a user using some policies. For example, it may define some policy like that there is some time validity of particular certificate. So up to that time, it can use that certificate, and then it will be reissued to the user. So that this type of policy, when we define this type of policy, that will make a certificate which is send it to the user. The intruder, if an intruder has got the previous certificate, then he cannot use that certificate, a new certificate, to authenticate itself to the user. So in this way, we can protect the user from having the certificate which is not used by that user. So if it is not used by that user, then he will not be able to authenticate itself to the receiver, for example. So in this way, we have different types of certificates are involved and how they are defined, and different policies are also defined for those. And then we can also define different, you can say, different certificates for different users. It may have multiple certification authorities also. For example, there could be a hierarchy of certification authorities, and if any of the certification authority, for example, is not working, then other certification authority may send the certificate to the user. So in this way, we can manage different certification authorities, so that we can smoothly send certificates to different users, and we can define the policies for that as we discussed. And then we have some other methods like um, is we have hierarchy of, you can say, certification authorities. So in this way, we can also have multiple levels for authentication. For example, verification or authentication using an email address, or verification or authentication using a username and password, or verification or authentication on the basis of some background, for example. So it depends on the different verification methods. And so we can also use different verification methods to authenticate a user or to authenticate different users. So when we do this type of method, then we can also further secure the data. We can also further secure the, you can say, system, that if any of the user is going to log into the system, then he can be authenticated uh, with a background, with a name, username and address, for example, or username and password, or email address. So in this way, they can be verified using multiple levels, and each level is actually having a particular feature which is applied to verify a particular user in the system to log into the system. So in this way, we are defining different policies for authentication. We are defining different policies for certification authority, that how many levels of certification authority are used. Either there would be a single certification authority used, or there would be a multiple certification authorities are used in order to send the certificate to different users. So we have different policies in this sense, and we can also apply some sort of mechanism which is called as a naming, for example. So when we apply that on a data, then it will have, for example, we have if we apply that, that it can identify a particular user on the basis of some name, for example, or some identity that would be used for identifying particular user. It could be it could have multiple identifiers which can have different roles for that. For example, if they are the different users using particular, you can say, data, particular services in the system, may have a single user having different IDs, a different identification, and each ID would be have a different for different service can be used. Or for example, there could be a single identity for each user, and in this way they can use a particular service on the basis of date ID, on the basis of data identification. So these are different methods which are applied whenever we are identifying particular user in a system, so that we can the authorized user can access particular service in the system. And then we have some certificates, like the example of such certificate is X.509 certificate. So it can be used to certify a user, and it is different properties, different features on that. So it can be used, for example, for an organization, and for the department, or some the other different units in the department. So it can be used for each department, for example. So in this way, the each certificate can identify particular user in an organization, and that would be used to verify a particular user. That would be used to verify a particular, you can say, service, particular entity which is used to access the data in some organization or some department, for example. So that's why we have a different so we have different standards for certificates, and we can define these certificates to identify a particular user. And then we have uh, we are using different identities for different purposes. Like for example, we are using driving licenses to identify that there's a legitimate driver, for example, or fingerprints to identify in a system that is actually the legitimate user is going to access the system. Or thumbprint can be used, or biometrics can be used to identify a particular user, that is a legitimate user to which is going to access the data, or which is going to access the system. So in this way, we can do this by applying different methods like that. And when we apply these different methods, then they are used to verify a particular user, and they are used to verify a particular user having specific authentication method applied to log into the system. So in this way, we can use different methods which are applied to log into the system. And then we can use trusted authorities, as we are discussing, that they are sending the certificates, or they are sending the keys to the users. because there is a chance of getting the key by the intruder or by the taker, and then he can use that key, and after using that key they can also apply on some data, and when they apply on some data they can encrypt the data using encrypt the, you can say, message with that key, and then the receiver can receive that data and decrypt this. So in this way, the intruder or an attacker can add its own message, which would be sent it to the other, you can say, receiver, for example. So these are the different methods which are used to be applied on some data, which are used to be applied on some keys which are sent it from sender to the receiver in this sense, or in this example, is they are intermediaries, trusted authorities are used to send the different keys to different users, and when they are sending the different keys to different users, they can use them and use them as a, you can say, secret key or the key for encryption, and then the receiver can use that for decryption. So we have different methods in this way used, and so we can also have some trusted models, like for example, there could be a single certification authority, there could be a multiple certification authorities, as how they are connected with each other, and how they are sending the different certificate to the different users. So these are the different, you can say, methods which are applied whenever we are discussing about different models which are used to be applied on by the user to verify a particular user, that either that particular user is having some data, or that particular user is having some, you can say, uh, data which is authenticated data, which is sent it by authenticated user, and thus they are verified using a model or using different certificates. They are called as certification authorities, which are trusted authorities, and they form different structures. When they form different structures, so they are forming different models for that. For example, single or multiple certification authorities can be used to send the certificate to the users. So if you have any question up to now, you can ask. Is there any question? Okay, so